To Chautauqua Institution.
Good to be here.
Your career path, you born where?
I was born in Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay. You found yourself in during high school in Kansas City?
Yes.
College?
Came out to the West Coast to Stanford in 1944, and four of us, as a matter of fact,
Okay.
came out from Kansas City. Yes.
Now, from that geographical area, was that the Harvard? Was that your, in essence, being in the West Coast and you being sort of west of the Mississippi? Was that the goal?
Well, actually, my decision was really encouraged by a teacher that I had, a social sciences teacher who was a Stanford alum and was very high on Stanford. Stanford had a good reputation there in Kansas City in the Middle West, and so I made the decision to come west to school, which I never regretted.
Is that from Stanford you went?
My career was interrupted. This was right before the VJ Day in June of '45, and a number of us were deciding what to do. I tried to enlist in the Navy, and because of my eyesight, couldn't. So several of us went into the Merchant Marine, and I sailed for about 2 years, mostly taking coal to Europe, which was right after World War II. And so after a year at Stanford undergraduate, I was out for 2 years, then came back in '47, and I took the rest of my undergraduate and started in law school a year early. You could, in those days, do a 3-3 program. I had two profs in undergraduate that I think led me to law school. One who taught business, Harry Rathbun, from a very strong ethical overview, and the other was Charles Fairman, who taught constitutional law undergraduate in law school. And Professor Fairman was really a mentor to me. I thought he encouraged me to go to law school, and I think it was largely through his course and his encouragement that I did go to law school, and that's where I took my law then, after finishing undergraduate and graduate.
So you go to law school and you had Phil Neal as one of your professors?
Yes, Phil Neal taught antitrust law then, and I had Professor Neal for antitrust law then.
Did you get a sense, well, then at some point your career path finds your way to Hugo Black. How did that occur?
No, William Douglas.
Oh, sure, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely right. Wait, how'd that occur?
I graduated first in my class at Stanford, and so in those days, William Douglas had a former clerk, Stanley Sparrow, who was practicing in Oakland, select his clerk for him. He never did interviews personally himself, and so Stanford put me forward as a candidate for the clerkship. 2 years before, Warren Christopher had been the first Stanford Law School graduate to become a law clerk at the Supreme Court, and had clerked for Douglas. So in any event, I was the one who was in the competition, and Stan Sparrow selected me, recommended that I be the clerk to go back for the '51 term.
What did you know about Douglas before you really, the first time you met him was probably in Washington, right?
That's right, because he usually spent the summer out in the West in Goose Prairie, and I didn't meet him till he came back to Washington. All I knew was a public persona. He was a Westerner, a presumably laid-back Westerner, but Stan Sparrow had warned me that you had to be careful of public appearance, that in fact that it was a hard job. He was all business in the chambers when you were working with him across the desk, and a demanding person, and that's the way it turned out to be. If you got him outside that context, he could be charming and amusing and a good person to be around, but he was a tough boss when you were working with him across the desk.
Did you have much chance to interrelate with the other justices? And I'm leading myself to Robert Jackson and
Certainly.
his clerks. Was that part of the esprit within the clerks to get to know the other clerks?
Absolutely. It was really one of the most satisfying parts of the time spent back there was the relationships you developed and the friendships you developed with other clerks. Actually, Bill Rehnquist had been in the class behind me at Stanford, and he finished early and then came back. I had come in by the fall. He came after the first of the year in '52, so our time overlapped, and we knew each other from our time together at Stanford. And but I got to know the other clerks early on, and as I say, working together, we used to eat lunch fairly regularly in the clerks' dining room and chat. And there were other occasions when there would be social events the clerks would have. So it was a good experience.
You talk about the two clerks. One was George Niebank, and the other was Cliff Rehnquist, which you talked about. Any impressions on George Niebank?
Not specifically. I have to plead a certain lapse of memory. After all, this is well over 50 years ago, and so, memory is rather spotty. Some things you remember very well, some things you don't. Much fades, but I simply remember him as an agreeable person. All of them were very bright, able law clerks.
Jackson. When I use the term Jackson, what's that mean to a Marshall Swell?
Well, I have one very clear impression of Justice Jackson when I try and search my memory, because I did not have much actual relationship with him. I did with Bill Rehnquist because I'd known him, but I remember very distinctly one birthday party they held for the justice, or his birthday, the term I was there, and the clerks were all invited to come, and Felix Frankfurter was the only justice who was apparently invited to come, who was there, and so we chatted, but as it turned out, Justice Frankfurter, which was his custom, tended to be a magnet and attract young people, so that the occasion ended up with a number of the clerks kind of in a semicircle around Justice Frankfurter, with him firing questions back and forth, and the clerks responding, and Justice Jackson off kind of in a corner by himself with very few around him for his birthday. But that's one vivid memory I had. The interplay, I think he and Justice Frankfurter tended to work together. It was sort of my impression.
We often read about Jackson's ability in his command of the King's English. Was that something that was appreciated at the time that the clerks were there, or the justices? Did they comment on his writing skills, abilities? Did you get any sense?
My feeling, as I recall it, and that's one feeling I've kept over the years, was that he was an excellent writer. Among the justices on the court then, he was probably the best, or one of the best, in terms of expressing himself well, and I think that was generally acknowledged, that he really was accomplished at using the English language well.
We're going to talk a lot, I'm sure, over the next day or two about some of the other other cases that were about, including the Steele seizure case. But was there one case which sort of jumped out at you during that term that said, I remember that the most, or is that the one we'll be talking about, Steele seizure?
Well, there were several cases that were of interest that year. Of course, the Steele seizure was I think the most significant case in terms of constitutional law, and I felt, and I will speak later, that in retrospect, looking back at it, that I think Justice Jackson probably had the most nuanced and the best appreciation of the complexities involved in trying to sort through checks and balances and separation of powers in those kinds of situations. It was not nearly as simplistic approach as Justice Black took in a majority opinion, and in that sense, I think as you look back at it in the span of history, that Justice Jackson had I think, really a good appreciation for the issues, and that they were complex and they weren't susceptible of simply easy solutions.